Oh, we were on the next slide, huh? Yeah, we were on the slide. So this is typical of a K35, the ratios I gave, because what happens is your highest tier gets attacked right off the bat. You've heard me say that a few times. So once your ranged troops start getting targeted, for me it's tier 14. You said tier 12. So immediately, as soon as a type of troop starts targeting your archers, it's going to attack the highest tier first. So what happens is if you have 90% of your soldiers in the highest tier, they're going to be taking a lot of damage right away once that tier starts getting attacked. So different people have different ratios. Zorro, if you scroll up in the chat, you'll find one of his comments when I was giving this the first time. He uses a different ratio than this. It's personal preference to what works for you. You ask any player, they'll have a different ratio. This is just the one I prefer. So for me, it's 20% of my tier 14, 30% of my tier 13, and 50% of my tier 12. And you'll see the tier 12 deal a ton more damage than the tier 14. Yes, because there's more of them, but also the tier 14 started taking damage right away, whereas the tier 12 were safe because they had tier 14 and tier 13 above them. You're going to get to keep 32 and 35 fast enough that probably, excuse me, once PvP starts, you'll have tier 14 or at least tier 13. There's a pretty good chance. So that being said, if you had tier 13, you'd probably want to do something like 30% or 20% tier 13, then maybe 50% tier 12, and then you can put the rest into tier 11. I promise I can count. The reason for that is because tier 12 are a little bit unique in the game. At one point, I forgot what it was. I think it was K30 was or maybe 30. Yeah, it was 30, I'm pretty sure, was the highest keep in the game. So once they brought out K40 and tier 13 were introduced, their stats were actually very similar to tier 12. However, tier 12 point-wise are much more efficient, are much lower point-wise, I should say, than tier 13. So that being said, if you had a bunch of tier 12 and tier 13 fight each other, the tier 13 will win, but points-wise, they're probably going to lose just because tier 12 are worth, way less than tier 13. Oh, okay. Zorro said his ratio is a little bit different because he only has tier 13 at the moment. He doesn't have tier 14. But as I said, everybody uses a different ratio, and it depends on how many troops you have available. This isn't like a, cement block exact shape. You can mold it however you want. If you only have, when server war starts, a few thousand of your highest tier, it's not a big deal. Throw them in and then just ratio the rest of them. Does that answer your question, Gabs? Hopefully. You can just say yes or no. Okay, great. And then Dirk, I see you typing also. And if anybody has any questions, again, feel free to ask. If I only make tier 13 of one troop type, ranged, let's say, should I wait until I can send tier 13 of all troop types? No, not necessarily. So you're saying if you had tier 13 range, but you don't have tier 13 cavalry, siege, and infantry, the higher tiers for them, the most important is the damage dealer, which, yeah, that's correct, in which case is ranged. So the layers will still be pretty effective if you have, only like tier 12 of cavalry, 1,000 of them, tier 12 siege, even tier 11 infantry. Because ideally your ranged won't be getting targeted until either the siege layers have been chewed through by other siege, the cavalry layers have been chewed through by other cavalry, or the cavalry and ground troops have been chewed through by ground. So you'd be short one layer and you wouldn't perform as well, but it's still, you'd perform way better than having no layers at all. So that's my answer to the question. I mean, nothing's stopping you from just attacking with no layers, but you're going to get very poor results than if you were attacking with layers. I actually made a mistake this past battlefield and forgot to put layers on one of my marches. And you'll see I attacked a player who's like 1.7 billion. And he took 20 million damage, and I took 250 million damage, and all my troops got killed because of a simple mistake, and there were no layers. But if I had implemented layers, it would have been a drastically different result. So hopefully that answers your question. Some layers is better than no layers, is my official answer to the question. And let me know if okay, great, perfect. And Zoro's typing something too, so I'll see what that is. Yeah, so he said the same thing. He only has some lower level layers at the moment, but again, some layers are better than no layers. All right, back to the slides. So that was on offensive layers, by the way. That's what you send in an offensive march. I didn't put it on here actually, but when you're fighting in buildings, meaning ruins or Arctic barbarians, if those happen to be happening during SvS, or temples, thicker layers are more effective than thinner layers. So if you're fighting in buildings, you might want to send 5,000 of each troop type instead of 1,000 of each troop type. This isn't on the slideshow, but it's just quickly worth mentioning. The very simple whys are that you're not facing an enemy that has millions of troops that will one-shot your layer anyways. You're facing an enemy that typically has 1,000 in his layers. So you want to have 10,000 or 5,000 in your layers to one-shot his layers and deal damage faster. So I apologize, it's not on this slide, but just something to remember is that when fighting in buildings, thicker layers are better. So that's everything for offensive layers. Defensive layers, I talked earlier in depth about the tier 1 wall, but essentially it's because ranged troops, when they attack, get hung up on cavalry. So you want to have a bunch of tier 1 cavalry to absorb that range. Now, that being said, once you get a bunch of tier 1 cavalry, you can't ghost them. So later on, you'll see the levels of keeps in the game. But in the beginning, you're at the kind of ghost stage, meaning you want to, and I'll go into ghosting later on. That's a SvS strategy slide that I have. But you want to have all your troops out of the castle so that when they attack, basically there's nothing to kill, so they won't get any points. So later on, you'll want to start building a tier 1 wall, but it's not that effective right off the bat, which I'll get more into later. But it is a type of layer, so I want to go over it. With that out of the way, that preamble done, basically the tier 1 wall is just a bunch of tier 1 troops because they trade better than higher tier troops. So an example being one archer might attack a bunch of tier 1 cavalry and kill 30 of them. And then, but 30 tier 1 cavalry aren't worth that one archer. But then that one archer gets attacked and takes damage. And, 10 tier 14 archers die in that attack. But 10 tier 14 archers are worth way more than, 30 or however many. It'd actually be 300 tier 1 cavalry that those 10 archers killed. So that's the trade of points is more beneficial when tier 1s are absorbing the damage. But when you're dealing damage, it's better to have higher tier troops. The problem with tier 1s is you can't send hundreds of millions to attack. Otherwise, everybody would be doing it. So they only work on the defense. That's essentially how tier 1s work. But you get to that point once you have so many troops in your keep that you can't ghost them anymore. A very quick explanation for ghosting is when you click Alliance War on something, then you click 60 minutes and you send it off to march, those troops disappear from your castle. So when the enemy attacks, they're not going to be in the castle. I'll get more into ghosting later, but to give you guys an idea of it, that's what ghosting is. The last bullet point is probably the most important in the whole slide, I want to say, and that's not to overbuild, because in the beginning, I mean, it happened to me in my very first server. I got this concept that bigger number equals better. I'm doing better because I have more power, but that's really not the case. You can have a lot of troops, but if you don't have good buffs and don't have good research, those troops are worthless. And I have, a whole buff slide put together later on too. Somebody typed, oh, it was in a different part of the Discord. So I just want to be very clear not to overbuild, because you'll see, like I was saying earlier, examples of people who have built a tier 1 wall, let's say, and it's very effective, and now they want to build other layers. So you'll see, let's say, 4 million of each type of ground troop. But the reason that's not effective, even though you might think, well, these guys can deal damage and absorb damage, is because you're going to get hit with a mounted attack. And mounted attack ground first. That's their priority. So as soon as the troops meet, ground will fight ground, but then the cavalry come in and will absolutely trash ground, because when you're attacking, you typically have much higher buffs than when you're defending in an even battlefield. So the attacker is going to deal a lot more damage to those ground troops that you thought were such a good idea than they're going to deal to the attack. So you might completely wipe out the attack and kill all the cavalry, but you've, absorbed that much more damage than you've dealt to the attack. So that's why you don't want to overbuild. The same concept goes for cavalry. Let's say you built 4 million of each type of cavalry, but then you can't ghost 4 million of each type of cavalry, typically. So even if you ghost all your tier 14, all your tier 13, your tier 12 are going to get hit really hard with the ranged send, because they get targeted right away. So you really want to build a limited number of each layer, and then build a lot of ranged, because they can't get targeted that easily. So that's my, just in general, very important bullet point, not to overbuild. Research and upgrading your keep level are much more important than building troops. That's, I'm just going to leave it at that, but I just want to be very clear about overbuilding. Are there any questions on the last slide? I'll go back to it, but we were staring at it quite a bit. And I'm going to get water. I don't see anybody typing, so I assume everything's good. The picture is not that important. Don't let the math really scare you. I just have it up there for reference in case anybody's curious. I'll be doing a more advanced seminar later on for those of you that are actually curious about the math. But there's something called counterattack damage in the game, and it's not that important, but it's worth knowing if you're going to be doing PvP. So when troops attack each other, if they're not completely finished off, the dead troops count as still being alive for the other player's turn. So imagine you have a battle round, and in the round, the attacker attacks, then the defender defends with, defending attacks. But an example being what I used up here, if you have 40,000 or 50,000 soldiers and you're the defender, the attacker attacks you, those 50,000 soldiers suffer 40,000 damage. Then your turn rolls around. Because they didn't completely finish off your soldiers in that round, not the entire battle, but that round of fighting, your 50,000 soldiers will still deal damage on your turn. So you're still going to deal whatever damage to the attacker because the attacker didn't finish you off. Then on the next battle round, sure, you have 10,000 soldiers left. You're only going to attack with 10,000 or less soldiers. But in the round that your troops weren't finished off, you're going to deal full damage. So that's one of the reasons, pardon me, kind of burp. That's one of the reasons it's important to know this, and why I was saying you want thicker layers when fighting in buildings or temples in SvS. I don't know if you guys have seen the temples on the three corners of the map, but eventually we have to fight for those with troops in the buildings. Thicker layers are much more efficient when fighting in those because the enemy's layer will attack you. They'll deal a little bit of damage, but you'll still deal, the full layer will still make the attack. So a thicker layer in that situation can absorb the attack and then attack back with its full power until the next battle round. The reason that's important is because if you have thin layers and it gets attacked, and it'll get wiped out immediately, especially if it's like a 10-to-1 ratio. That's why you see right here this whole formula worked out by somebody much smarter than I am on the screen, is because it roughly equates to, at least for tier 1 siege, one soldier can kill a third of a troop. So if you outnumber the enemy by 10-to-1, let's say you put 10,000 or even 5,000 troops in your layer, your one layer will finish off their layer completely in one shot. So that layer won't deal damage to you. And what you have is a far more efficient system of attack with thicker layers. But this is only when you're fighting in buildings, because if you're attacking an enemy's castle, the thick layers won't matter. They're still going to get one shot anyways. I know this might be a little bit funky to wrap your head around, especially math scares a lot of people, I know. But all you have to know is when you're fighting in buildings, instead of doing 1,000 of each type of troop, which is the very common Ebony method, you want to do 5,000 to 10,000 of each troop type. You'll just get a much better exchange. That being said, buffs still beat everything, so you want to have good research and increased buffs. I haven't gotten over buffs yet. Some of you might not even know what I'm talking about, but I'll get to that in a second. Which, here's buffs now that we come to speak of it. So this is that same attack I showed you guys earlier. The buffs are these percentages that you see of plus X, Y, Z percentage of the attack, defense, and HP. And it's pretty simple to conceptually. You have a soldier with 100 attack, then he gets plus 719% attack. He's going to have 719 attack, I guess, to keep it simple. So that's a big increase from his original attack. So when you have one soldier who's worth a certain amount and another soldier who's worth the same amount, but the one with the percent buffs is, in this example, you'll see the range troops 719% to that defender's 320%, you're going to get a much better power exchange amongst even soldiers. And if you're facing inferior soldiers, it's going to be even better. I'll get into flat buffs. I didn't put the point on here, but some of you probably don't even know what they are. But to follow these bullet points first, first, how important they are. I explained it, but maybe I didn't emphasize it. One of the reasons this guy took so much damage in this battle, which is the one I showed earlier, is yes, he didn't have layers, but he also didn't have very good buffs. He's working on them, I'm sure. But this player had far better buffs that's attacking than the defender did. So his troops are going to go, at least for the ranged troops, twice as far as the defender's ranged troops. It's kind of funny because the defender didn't actually have any ranged troops, but pretend he did, his troops will go a lot further. They are really, really important. They're going to be your biggest source of competitiveness in the game. When you want to look and see if a player is competitive, a good player is going to scout them. He's not even going to look at how many troops he has. The first thing he looks at is what are his buffs. If he has 2,000% attack and I only have 1,000% attack, for sure, it's not even worth attacking him. I'm going to lose. So it's something really you have to look at when you're scouting a player and thinking, am I going to attack him or not? In SvS, it's 2 days long. We have plenty of time to scout, take things slow, go over things. If he has really high buffs and you have to fight him, you should rally him. It's the easiest way to attack. So with that out of the way, your biggest sources of buffs, your generals will give you a lot, typically 200 to 300%. If the general's fully maxed out, 5 red stars, really good gear. You can go pretty far. I mean, you can get 500 to 800% with the Civ gear on, honestly. But so generals, the books that you can put on generals, the gear, the refines that you put on gear. I don't really go into refining that much here, but if you didn't know, you can refine the gear that you put on generals. And then blazons, which a lot of you might have seen and is confusing for some people. Does anybody have any questions on refines and blazons? It's something I might need to put specifically a slideshow together for. But these are things in the game that can actually get you a very big percentage of buffs if you know what you're doing, which is what we're here to do, is to learn to know what we're doing. So I see some people typing. Okay, so there's some questions on blazons. Yeah, I can do them. If you guys want to hang out after I go through the main slideshow, I can just add some slides and take screenshots of my blazons and explain it, because it looks a little bit like it's a topic to go over. All I'm going to do is take photos and put them at the end of the slideshow. All right, let me go back to the main. So yeah, I'll go over blazons later. There's two types of buffs. There's situational buffs and generic buffs. So generic buffs are things that apply at all times. Like you might have a research that says cavalry attack plus 40% or whatever, and that's it. So that's a generic buff. So at all times, you'll have plus 40% to your attack. But you'll see, especially in blazons, actually, very situational buffs. It'll say when defending, when reinforcing, when attacking. So if you're defending and you have a bunch of gear that says when attacking, you're not going to get the buffs for that. Or if you're attacking and it says when defending, or for in-city troops, for example, you'll see a lot on choreo gear. If you're attacking with a general with choreo gear, you're not going to get those buffs because they're for certain situations that you're not in. So it's not, most people can look at it and just get the concept, but if you're not thinking about it, it can catch you really. So you might have a piece of gear on that'll say when attacking, and then you stick it on your defense general, or when attacking monsters is another one. Because I know like the Rurik axe, just a personal example for everybody. That was the first piece of Civ gear I ever got on my original server, and I thought it was the greatest thing in the world. It was God's gift to Civ gear. But I didn't know at the time what I was doing, and so I thought it was great for PvP, but it's really for monster hunting, and I didn't do nearly as much as I thought it did, because those buffs were situational and for monster hunting. So it's something to be aware of. The last one's debuffs. You'll see at the bottom of this, like the defender had minus 20%, the attacker had minus 38%. So debuffs take away from the opponent's buffs. They're, I'd honestly say, just important as, the buffs. Excuse me. They're just as important as the buffs for attack, Jesus. They're just as important as the percent buffs that increase your attacks that decrease the enemy's attacks. Because you're decreasing them by that much, it's as if you're attacking with that much more buffs. Mathematically, not so, but in your head, that's how important they should be. Debuffs typically come from subgenerals. The way it works is your subgenerals can get gear that increases your buffs. You can put it on there, but it only affects the subgeneral's troops when they join you in battle, not all of your troops, if that makes sense. But debuff gear will affect the opponent regardless if it's on your main general or the subgeneral. When I say subgeneral, I'm talking about a subordinate city general. So in case that's confusing people. So it's much more efficient, keeping in mind the ratio of, the amount that you debuff them is almost like the amount that you're buffing yourself in battle. It's much more efficient to give all of your subsidy generals debuff gear, which is Achaemenidae or Parthian gear, Parthian being the upgraded version of Achaemenidae. because you're debuffing the enemy general that much more than you would help your own troops by putting positive buffs on just your subordinate city troops. Hopefully that concept makes sense. And then the last thing I want to mention about about debuffs, is you can only debuff the opponent by half as much as they do have positive buffs. So if I'm attacking somebody with 1,000% in every category, whatever, I can only debuff them by 500%. I can't debuff them by 550% unless they had 1,100% in whatever category. So debuffs do work, but only as much as the enemy is positively buffed. That being said, it's a very good failsafe against stronger opponents because they have very high buffs. Like to give you an example, my ranged attack is 1,700% right now, so debuffs are very useful against that. Are there any questions on buffs and debuffs? I really can't emphasize how important it is, and you really can find buffs everywhere in the game. It's almost a funny trick that they did, because typically in an interface, you're trying to find something and you can't find it. It's buried in the interface and you have to go through all these things to find it. But buffs are literally in every aspect of the game. Some funny examples are when you offer at the shrine, you get 20% attack, defense, and HP. I don't know how many people knew that, but you do actually get that from the shrine of all places. Your duty generals will give you attack, defense, HP for different troops if you have the appropriate duty general. For example, the stable duty general can sometimes give a percent buff for attack or defense or HP or whatever for cavalry. So they're literally everywhere. The champions in your keep, blazons, refines, gears, generals, spiritual beast seals. You'll see at the bottom of this Discord, there's a ton of tips on blazons. So I just want to be clear that they're important and they're everywhere. So the game is saturated with buffs. It's like not a funny problem where you can't find it. It's actually everywhere, and it's like too overwhelming to find just one source of buffs. So it is, yes. And that is true what Durf said in his comment. You're not going to find anything that gives plus 500% buff to your soldiers. It's really a snowball effect of many little things built up. Honestly, Rainmaker, 80% of the gear, 80% of debuffs comes from subsidy gear. You'll find it in research. You'll find it in gear. You'll sometimes find it in duty generals, depending on the duty general. I know there's one or two that have it, but I couldn't give you a name off the top of my head. So I might be missing something. If any Zoro might know, for example, if there's more sources of debuffs. Dragons might give some. I honestly don't remember off the top of my head. Oh yeah, spiritual beasts give some, yeah. So most of it though comes from gear. I'd say at least the biggest percentage. Let's see.